Hey, good afternoon to you. 406 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. So much of it breaking as usual. Joe Biden and Volodomyr Zelenskyy are going to do a joint press conference soon. If anything comes of it, we will share it with you. Coming up, Congressman Matt Rosendale will be with us in just a few minutes. We'll be joined by Aaron Sibarium from the Washington Free Beacon this hour as well, as we get into all of the plagiarism that the current president of Harvard has committed and will not be punished for. And then Ralph Norman, the congressman, is with us at 5:30 as Congress is looking to expand the surveillance powers of the oh-so-well-behaved federal government. You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Yes, as a part of the annual National Defense Authorization Act, the military funding bill. There is a push right now to renew something called Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. You would know this best as the area of the law that was abused in order to spy on American citizens, to include members of the Trump campaign during the 2016 election. Carter Page, ring any bells? Yes, spying on American citizens with a reckless abandon is something that the federal government has done countless times using this power, Section 702 of FISA. They're conducting warrantless, what they refer to as backdoor searches of the American people. And there are only a few Republican lawmakers who are willing to say that this is a problem out loud. The Hill has a piece up today. Senate leaders face conservative rebellion on annual defense bill. And I'm bringing attention to this story because this is one of those pieces. It's like one of those things. It has massive implications for liberty in the United States going forward. Massive implications. And deserves a little bit more of our attention. So here we go. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Republican Leader Mitch McConnell are facing a rebellion. Notice that they're on the same side on this issue, Schumer and McConnell. They're facing a rebellion from conservative senators over the annual National Defense Authorization Act, which has passed on time for 62 years in a row, the Hill says, like it's supposed to happen always. Well, it always passes on time for the last 62 years, so it has to again. Can't get in the way of that. The battle over the popular bipartisan bill comes to a head Tuesday. Senators Josh Hawley, Rand Paul, and Mike Lee are raising objections to the popular bill, forcing Schumer to scramble to keep it on track. Now, Hawley is protesting the decision to strip the bill from the bill, his amendment to extend something called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to cover families in the St. Louis area, that would be his state, who have been exposed to improperly stored radioactive waste. So that's Josh Hawley's concern in this bill, or at least the one that he's vocalizing. Meanwhile, Senators Paul and Lee are deeply concerned and objecting to a 4-month extension of Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Embedded in the defense bill, the Section 702 language allows the National Security Agency to intercept broad swaths of foreign communications without individualized court orders, inevitably sweeping up the conversations of American citizens. Rand Paul said this, quote, "Approving FISA without reforming it is a huge mistake. It goes against our own rules. Our rules say that the conference report can only include things that were in the House version or the Senate version. This is being airdropped into something the rules say you can't do." So he's raising a point of order objection to this, meaning Schumer and McConnell will need to round up 60 votes to quash Rand Paul's blockade. Mike Lee this past week has written, I think, a characteristically eloquent piece on why this is a terrible idea and that the American public needs to be aware of it. And let me quote from some of this piece. I think it's worth your while. The headline on it is, "Congress Don't Pass the Defense Bill Without FISA Reform." It's published this week in The Blaze. Don't pass the defense bill without FISA reform. And Mike Lee says this, "The FBI has used Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to conduct warrantless backdoor searches of the private electronic communications of American citizens. It has done so, moreover, not just sporadically and by accident, but quite deliberately, and on, ready for the number, hundreds of thousands of occasions. The FBI has spied on the American people using this power hundreds of thousands of times. While the technology employed in those searches may be new, the issues surrounding it are not. In fact, they have been hundreds of years in the making. And then Senator Lee takes us on a history lesson. In 1763, John Wilkes, a member of the British Parliament, was arrested in his home, subjected to an aggressive search because he wrote and published number 45 of a periodical known as the North Briton. North Briton number 45 had infuriated King George III and his ministers because it called out their widespread and unlawful use of general warrants, which were official documents authorizing searches and seizures that were backed by neither evidence establishing probable cause nor a specific description of the intended target. In essence, general warrants purported to tell the king's officers, quote, go search for evidence of a crime in any home or other place you might expect to find it, and then seize it. That's what we would call tyranny. And that's what you're seeing a lot of these days, isn't it? Where you have the federal government picking targets, not crimes, and then finding crimes after they pick their targets. Unwittingly proving Wilkes's point, Lee continues, the king's men used general warrants to search his home and the homes of others suspected of participating in the publication of North Briton number 45. After spending several days locked in the Tower of London, Wilkes returned to his home to find it in complete disarray, with many items severely damaged and others missing altogether. Incensed by the injustice, he challenged the validity of the general warrant at issue, and he sued the officers who had conducted the search. Long story short, Wilkes won and was awarded that is a large sum of money as a part of the victory. As word of his victorious effort spread, Wilkes's story became famous on both sides of the Atlantic, leading ultimately to the adoption of the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. The number 45, referring to the publication that had offended the king and sparked the entire episode, became synonymous with both John Wilkes and the cause of liberty in England and the American colonies. Wasn't that an interesting piece of history? Number 45 became associated with the cause of liberty. Now, who is connected to the number 45? Is there anybody you can think of in the recent history? Oh, that's right. Donald Trump was president. He was the 45th president of the United States. I'm not saying that there's a big connection between those things. I don't know. I just find it very interesting. Of course, Trump was elected in defense of the cause of liberty and against the corruption of Washington and its tyranny. Indeed, Lee says, one might say that 45 became the roll tide of those who wanted to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. As Wilkes became a cult figure in the colonies, a motto of sorts based on the Apostles' Creed was written and published in Boston. It began this way, quote, I believe in Wilkes, the firm patriot, maker of number 45, who was born for our good, suffered under arbitrary power, was banished and imprisoned. That's how they talked in the beginning of our country. In the colonies. Elsewhere in the colonies, Wilkes was honored by the naming of Wilkes County, Georgia, Wilkesboro, North Carolina, and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Even George III's own young children caught the Wilkes fever. They sometimes opened the door to their father's room and they cried, Wilkes and number 45 forever, just to prank the monarch. John Wilkes, Mike Lee says, would be shocked by FISA 702, which the FBI has used hundreds of thousands of times to spy on Americans without a warrant. There have been essentially no consequences for the agents and the agencies who repeatedly violate the Fourth Amendment. As a lawmaker and an advocate of liberty, he'd be appalled that the United States Congress is preparing right now to reauthorize FISA 702 without a single reform. Congress is making this decision not on its own merits, but as a part of a last-minute addition to the 3,000-page National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2024. Congress is obscuring its own indefensible actions by hiding this provision in a lengthy must-pass bill dealing with other, far less controversial matters. Shameful. He goes on to essentially implore, beg, demand Congress reform Section 702 to stop this, the illegal surveillance of the American people, the unconstitutional surveillance of the American people. It is time for it to stop, Mike Lee is writing today. this week. And we'll get into the details more on this coming up. Congressman Ralph Norman is going to join us from South Carolina at 5:30 and give us the latest state of play within Congress. Is this thing going to be passed again, or is it going away? It's a story you're not hearing a tremendous amount about because Republicans and Democrats largely agree the federal government should have the ability to spy on you. Section 702 of FISA set to be renewed. Not all Republicans are for it, though. My next guest, Congressman Matt Rosendale of Montana. We have a lot to talk about real quick in a short period of time. Congressman Rosendale, great to have you with us, sir.
Vince, always good to be on.
What's the deal here? Is Congress going to reauthorize this spying on the American people, and can it be stopped?
So what you have going on right now is a discussion or a debate between the Judiciary Committee, which is trying to put some dramatic reforms on FISA in the 702 section, and you have the Intel Committee that says, oh, no, everything's fine, nothing to see here, because they never saw anyone that they didn't want to be able to get the intelligence and the surveillance conducted upon. And so that's why you hear there are two bills, and they both got pulled from the floor, and now they are telling us that they're going to bring the extension of the FISA as it currently exists. They are going to attach it to the NDAA, not the House version that stripped out taxpayer funding for abortions, that stripped out taxpayer funding for transgender surgeries, that stripped out new Green Deal provisions and battery-operated Jeeps. No, we're going to have the Senate version of the NDAA that still has taxpayers paying for all of those things, and then we're going to take that crap sandwich and we're going to make it worse by putting another pile of crap on it by extending 702 or FISA within the same document.
So wait, I'm sorry. If I understand this correctly, what this means is Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, are only willing to fund the military if Americans can continue to be spied on?
Oh, and as long as the military can provide the funding for transgender surgeries, abortions, and battery-operated Jeeps, too, apparently.
Boy, our priorities are screwed up, aren't they?
It's a mess. It's a mess, Vince. I will not vote for that. Unfortunately, there's a mechanism that we typically were able to use. It's called voting against the rule. And when we passed that new set of rules in January to reform Congress, we were able to make sure that we had provisions like that in there that would keep us from being able to even consider this. There's another provision that we had passed in the rules that says that we will have a single subject piece of legislation, okay? And this clearly violates that by putting the national security provisions of 702 into the National Defense Act. And so it should not even be considered, but again, if you suspend the rules and you get 2/3 of the House to go ahead and go along with that, so you're going to get a whole bunch of Democrats and most of the Republicans to pass this. So, and I'm going to wait and see if we can muster up 100 or so Republicans that say, no, we're not willing to sign off on this.
Well, this doesn't all happen without Speaker Mike Johnson enabling it, does it? I mean, what's his role in all of this?
It doesn't happen without Speaker Johnson requesting it, and I am distraught right now that he would bring this piece of legislation or allow it to be brought forward. It's very problematic.
Let me talk about something else, another issue that's facing Congress right now, which is Volodomyr Zelenskyy just wrapped up a visit to the White House. Or he is in the midst of a visit to the White House right now. They're going to do a press conference soon, both Biden and Zelenskyy. He is coming hat in hand. He wants $60 billion, or at least that's what the Biden administration wants to give him. Joe Biden and company are insisting that Congress better do it and stop demanding money to secure our own border. How do you read all of this?
That's ridiculous. I'd put a big piece of coal in Zelensky's Christmas stocking if it was up to me. There is no way that we should be sending more money to Ukraine while our southern border is completely wide open. We've lost a couple of 100,000 American lives due to drug overdoses, most of which has come from fentanyl, that have come across the southern border since all of this began. And it is outrageous that this administration would be considering. They're not just considering. They have been trying to strong arm the House into this deal for quite some time. Unfortunately, Mitch and Chuck Schumer are fine. They're doing a dance together about sending additional money to Ukraine, and the way that they're trying to intimidate us, to force us, to coerce the House to do it, is to continue to hang ornaments on the Christmas tree. They started with Israel. They added in disaster relief. They're adding in anything that they think they can to get constituents across the nation to add additional pressure onto the House to try and pass this. Meanwhile, we've not had an accounting of the $100 billion that's already been sent to Ukraine. I'm trying to figure out if Hunter Biden and the big guy haven't already divvied up a bunch of it.
So when members of the Biden administration come to talk to you about the latest on Ukraine, what do they say about how the money's being spent? What assurances do they give you that it's going to be spent efficiently going forward? And what do they tell you about how this war ends?
They don't, and this is the problem. They have been submitted or presented with a list of questions that even some of the more moderate members say, look, even we can't go along with this unless you can outline what the mission is, what the goals are, where this money is going to be spent, how it's going to be spent, and they have never answered any of those questions. So I think that they are going to be met with some heavy opposition. They've started putting in the southern border.
Yes.
You see, they're trying to add money there. But Vince, you and I both know that is not money to complete the security system. That's not money to complete the wall and the fiber optics in the ground and the camera system and the roads that parallel the wall. This is merely money to go down there and build temporary housing and provide social support for illegals, thereby exasperating the situation and incentivizing and enticing more illegals to come to our country.
All right. Well, Congressman Matt Rosendale, always appreciate your time. When we have a little bit more of it, I'm going to ask you whether or not you're ready to finally pull the trigger and run for Senate. We'll talk about that next time you're on. In the meantime, Congressman, thank you very much. Good to talk to you, sir.
Thank you, Vince.
All right. That's Congressman Matt Rosendale. Coming up on this program, we're going to be joined by Aaron Sibarium from the Washington Free Beacon. He dug into the academic record of the current president of Harvard. Her name's Claudine Gay. It turns out she stole huge sections of her own supposed academic work. What kind of consequences is she facing? We'll tell you. It's not going to surprise you. Aaron Sibarium with a great report coming up. Good afternoon to you. 436 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we are making sense of the news, and it just keeps on breaking. We await remarks from Presidents Biden and Zelenskyy, set to start at any time. If there's any news that comes from that, we'll share it with you. Also, we'll be joined by Congressman Ralph Norman in the next hour at 5:30 as Congress looks to renew and expand the surveillance powers of the United States federal government over American citizens. Of course, they've done nothing to deserve that power at all. And you can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. One of the three spectacularly awful college presidents to testify before Congress this past week was the president of Harvard, a woman by the name of Claudine Gay. And during that testimony, of course, she said that if students on campus were calling for the genocide of Jews, that it wouldn't violate the campus code of conduct necessarily, because she'd have to know the context for such a call before she could render a judgment. This has led to some pandemonium in higher education, especially as donors begin, big donors begin quitting their contributions to places like the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and MIT. And amidst all of this, Claudine Gay has also earned some scrutiny for her academic record. It turns out she stole a lot of it. She's a plagiarist. And joining me now is a reporter who's dug into the details on this subject in a meaningful way. It's Aaron Sibarium, associate editor of the Washington Free Beacon. He joins us on the phone. Hello, Aaron.
Hello.
Okay, so Claudine Gay, give us a sense of who she is, and then tell us what your reporting revealed.
Sure. Claudine Gay is Harvard's 30th president, but her publication record is significantly less distinguished than a lot of her predecessors. Larry Summers, in the past decade, he's the former president of Harvard, had, it must have been well over 50 articles in the past 10, 12 years. Claudine Gay has just 11, which is an extraordinarily short, in her entire career, which is an extraordinarily short CV for the president of a university like Harvard. Now, if all of those papers were really, really, really good works of original scholarship, you might think, well, okay, quality over quantity. But it turns out that significant portions of that scholarly corpus aren't even her own work, at least according to a very detailed review that the Free Beacon conducted along with almost a dozen other scholars. We found in 4 papers published over the past 20 years, about 29 instances of possible plagiarism, some more severe than others. But in the most severe cases, she airlifts entire passages from other authors, like entire paragraphs, without attribution, without putting them in quotation marks, in some cases without even citing the author anywhere in her bibliography. About as clear-cut a case of plagiarism as you can possibly get.
Now, this is almost like I just, having been to college for one, but also just recognizing the way that these prestigious institutions treat infractions like this. This is practically a human rights violation. Like, this is the kind of thing that would get you banished from those institutions forever, right? If you were a student who was plagiarizing.
Yeah. So, people have been debating this, and my sense is that, at Harvard, right, they kind of coddle their students. So if you just had one of these things in your paper, probably not going to be kicked off campus, but you probably get at minimum a firm talking to you and be told to rewrite that passage, possibly redo the entire paper.
Right.
And if you did it, more serially, then you might face like more severe disciplinary action. If the defense of her is, well, I wouldn't kick the student off campus, I would just tell them this isn't acceptable. Okay, so you're saying that Harvard's 30th president, the president of the most prestigious university in the world, isn't meeting the standards that professors would hold undergraduates to? Maybe they wouldn't punish the undergrads for the transgressions, but that's, I think we want a bar that's a little higher for the president of Harvard, not just, well, she wouldn't have gotten kicked off campus. Okay. Ideally, it would be, this is all original, groundbreaking, breathtakingly beautiful scholarship. And that doesn't seem to be the case here.
No, not at all. In fact, there's among the people whose work was stolen is a conservative scholar by the name of Dr. Carol Swain, who is also a black woman, just like Claudine Gay. And Dr. Swain wrote this today on Twitter, quote, "I rarely get angry, but I am angry right now about the racial double standards that are temporarily giving Claudine Gay an opportunity to resign. White progressives created her, and white progressives are protecting her. The rest of us have had to work our rear ends off to achieve success. Some get it handed to them." And she's referring to the fact that last night, the board at Harvard decided not to fire Claudine Gay, but instead to keep her in the role. And they suggested that whatever passages may look like they've been plagiarized, well, they're going to add the appropriate quotation marks and citations now, and everything should be forgiven. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and I would just add that they claim to have been alerted to these allegations, or at least some of them, in late October. They say that they commissioned some kind of independent review of the allegations with distinguished political scientists who aren't named. They haven't released the results of that investigation. And, they say that she's correcting something like 2 papers in 4 places, but we found far more than that. And even just the most severe examples that we published, which was non-exhaustive, there were, I think, at least 7, 8. I mean, we published like
Yes.
over 10 examples of pretty clear plagiarism. So it's hard for me to believe that she's asked for corrections in all of the relevant cases. And even if you're inclined to be maximally charitable to her, I'd at least like to see what this review concluded and
Yes.
to even see what the allegations were that it was working with. I mean, it's worth noting that statement from the Harvard Corporation is much more sanguine about her plagiarism than Harvard's own student newspaper, which, while acknowledging that some examples were worse than others, more or less ended up substantiating my reporting and agreeing with me and said, yeah, some of these appear to violate Harvard's student rules for plagiarism.
Right.
This is pretty clear cut, and said that it could damage her presidency. So, the kids on the Harvard Crimson, who I think are probably generally inclined to be more defensive of Gay, even they seem to think that she really screwed up. So I think that's saying something.
Yeah, it definitely is. They've recognized it and they've said it too. So the fact, so this gets back to, like, we talked about some of the reasons she's in this role. She is the first, as I understand it, the first black woman to be the president of Harvard. To what extent is that the reason that she is apparently going to survive all of this, stealing other people's work and saying that, calling for the genocide of Jews wouldn't violate the school's code of conduct necessarily? It would be context dependent. To what extent does her race and gender insulate her from consequences?
I'm sure it plays some role. It would be absurd to deny that it does. But I think that in some ways, it's not just her race or gender. It's also the ideology that she has espoused, right? And also the actions she took as the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences before she became president. This is a woman who worked tirelessly to beef up Harvard's DEI apparatus. She was involved in the defenestration of Roland Fryer, who's the star black economist who ruffled some feathers by saying that there wasn't actually racial bias in police shootings. There were some, I think, very weak Title IX charges that were kind of ginned up, and she was involved in that. She helped strip of an administrative post Ronald Sullivan, who's a Harvard law professor who served on Harvey Weinstein's defense team, pissed Gay and some students off because how dare you defend an unpopular defendant? God forbid we have that in our criminal justice system. And then there's even reports more recently that she helped squash some allegations of research fraud against one of her colleagues in the political science department. So this is a woman who I think rewards friends and punishes enemies. So I really think that you have to look at this in the context of her as a kind of expert administrator who plays the games of palace intrigue, believes in DEI, yes, but also knows how to kind of engineer the bureaucracy around her so that she's safe and secure. I think that's a big part of what's going on here, is that whatever role her race may have played, she's also a very shrewd political operator who has been saying what the commissars at Harvard want to hear for the past really probably decade.
Yeah, and she's part of a system that has advanced racial prejudice as a matter of course. I mean, Harvard obviously has been caught, admitting students and denying students on the basis of their race. That's sort of how the whole operation runs there.
Yeah. It is worth emphasizing that the two individuals who she's been involved in quote-unquote canceling were both black professors. I do think that's also an interesting dynamic here. Black professors who, in their own ways, transgressed certain progressive taboos.
So what happens next here? Does Harvard do you suspect that the plan is just to ride this out, to weather the controversy, to take even the criticism of their own student newspaper, the Harvard Crimson, and hope everybody forgets this come next week?
That may be the strategy. It could work, but I don't want to hazard any strong predictions here because this is also fluid, but I wouldn't be surprised if she holds on for another year or two, but then takes an early retirement, simply because I just, frankly, if I were her, I mean, even looking at placing all of this in the best positive light for her, just like why would you want to be in this position, right? You're already under scrutiny. It's not just a couple billionaires. It's lots of normal people, including, frankly, Democrats, right? There's bipartisan outrage. There have been Democrats who called for her to resign.
Yes.
I think that the wound here runs very deep. And if you're her, just how are you going to be the president of Harvard and have a semi-functioning life? I mean, every day when you wake up, if you've alienated so many people. So I think even if she holds on for now, people shouldn't assume that means she's going to be there for the next 5-10 years. I mean, it just seems could happen, but that would surprise me, frankly.
Aaron Sibarium, lastly, you follow these universities really closely. You've reported on them for years. And we see today an update at the University of Pennsylvania where there was the resignation of the president, Liz McGill. That was earlier this week. Then you've got the replacement now being named the interim president, a guy by the name of Dr. J. Larry Jameson, not to be confused with J. Jonah Jameson from the Spider-Man comics. He's coming in to be the president. And do you think that these universities have learned any lessons from all of this? They've got all these donors who are bailing on their institutions, saying that the racial bigotry on campus has just grown completely out of control. Will there be a change in higher education or no?
It's a good question. I think that there are sort of two forces here that push in different directions. So the first is that there have been, even if you think these are justified, fundamentally there have been demands from deep-pocketed donors to, in effect, censor speech. And you can argue that the speech is calling for violence and is genocidal and shouldn't be protected. But the fact remains there are people using the language of safety and harm now, just using it kind of on behalf of a group that isn't normally included in the DEI apparatus. So there's one, I think, force here that may, in the short run at least, strengthen the forces of censorship, and universities might respond to this by just doubling down on DEI, but trying to include Jews within it. I don't think that's going to work for all sorts of reasons, but that is, I think, going to be one tactic. But then I think there's another force that's going to ultimately, in the long run, push in the other direction, which is that these institutions are dominated by leftists who like to censor conservative speech, but Republicans have just shown that they are capable of inflicting absolutely brutal PR punishment on these places with a simple congressional hearing. And one person's already resigned. Another person, Claudine Gay maybe will hold on, but she's clearly, her position's very precarious. I think this is going to teach people there is a limit to how much you can piss off the public and also, in particular, Republicans without there being blowback. And my hope, perhaps this is naive, is that will create an incentive structure that in the long run forces these institutions to be a little less gung-ho about DEI. Maybe they censor more speech in the short run, but hopefully in the long run they realize, okay, if we're going to allow the chance for genocide, but we're not going to allow misgendering or whatever, that's just not a stable equilibrium. So maybe in the long run, it actually does conduce to a more open academic environment. Well, I don't know, but certainly these college presidents
yes.
from now on are going to be scared of angering politicians in a way that they were not before.
And the only way they get scared is if they're scrutinized, and the only way they're scrutinized is if people like Aaron Sibarium dig in. So thank you, Aaron. Thank you for the public service you've done yet again on this issue and so many others. Really appreciate your time today. There's a bit of a panic going on about whether or not the Washington Capitals and company, all the associated professional sports teams that are there at the Capital One Arena, might move out of D.C. You see all of this? The chatter yesterday published in the Washington Post that they may be moving to Northern Virginia. We'll see if a deal occurs. And Corey was just telling me, Corey, they're having an event tomorrow morning now, right? Glenn Youngkin and Ted Leonsis with Monumental are going to be doing this at 9 a.m. in Northern Virginia. The topic is, as of this moment, relatively unspecified. But you can take a wild guess as to what they may be announcing or at least flirting with. Is this a play to put pressure on D.C. to cough up some more goodies to keep these professional sports teams in town? I guess we'll find out, but that's, yet again, the breaking news that we always cover here on WMAL. Coming up, Congressman Ralph Norman will be with us. In the next hour, we'll talk to him about Congress's effort to keep letting the feds spy on us. Can that effort be stopped? We'll ask the congressman.